The wind whispers across the quiet field, brushing through the grass that has grown over what was once a place of unimaginable suffering. Ravensbrück, a small village north of Berlin, looks peaceful now. The barracks stand empty, their wooden walls faded by time and rain. The lake nearby reflects only the gray sky, not the cries that once echoed across its surface. Yet beneath this silence lies a story that the world must never forget, the story of a place built to destroy, where thousands of women learned, against all odds, how to survive, how to love, and how to sing. There were no battlefields here, no roaring tanks, no heroic charges. Only fences of barbed wire, watchtowers, and endless roll calls in the freezing dawn. This was Ravensbrück, the only major Nazi concentration camp built exclusively for women. Between 1939 and 1945, more than 130,000 women from over 20 nations were imprisoned here. Jews, Poles, Russians, French resistance fighters, Roma women, political prisoners, and anyone the Nazi regime labeled as undesirable. Some were barely teenagers. Others were mothers, teachers, doctors, nurses, nuns, artists. Here, in this desolate camp, all of them were stripped of their names and given numbers. Now, decades later, the birds sing above these ruins. Tourists walk slowly along the gravel paths, reading the memorial stones etched with names, or sometimes, with nothing but the word unknown. The air is heavy, not just with the weight of history, but with the memory of courage. It is difficult to imagine that this silence once held the sound of marching boots, barking dogs, shouted orders, and the muffled weeping of thousands. It is harder still to imagine that among those sounds, there were also songs, fragile, trembling, defiant songs sung by women who refused to let their spirits die. When you stand in Ravensbrück today, it feels as though time has stopped. The sky stretches endlessly above, pale and cold, the same sky those women once looked up to. If you close your eyes, you could almost hear them, a faint melody, carried by the wind. It is the sound of survival, of friendship, of faith in humanity, when all hope seemed lost. This story is not only about horror. It is about strength born from despair, light carved out of darkness, and the human voice that dared to sing when silence was safer. Ravensbrück was built to erase these women from the world. Yet through memory, through testimony, and through the songs they left behind, they still speak to us. And if we listen closely, we will hear them, whispering through the cold air, "Remember us. Remember how we sang in hell." Ravensbrück began as an idea conceived in the dark corridors of the Nazi state, where human lives were counted not as souls, but as statistics. In 1938, the SS decided to build a new camp exclusively for women. It would stand near the quiet German town of Fürstenberg, surrounded by forests and a lake, a cruel irony, for the beauty of nature would soon frame one of the most dreadful scenes in modern history. By May 1939, the first prisoners arrived, a few hundred women transferred from Lichtenberg, an earlier and smaller camp. They were political opponents, prostitutes, Jehovah's Witnesses, or simply women who had dared to live outside the rules set by the Nazi regime. What began as a small camp quickly expanded into a vast system of suffering. The purpose of Ravensbrück was not merely imprisonment. It was control, degradation, and the systematic destruction of dignity. The camp became a model for how to break the spirit of women while exploiting their labor for the war machine. As Germany invaded Poland and the war spread across Europe, train after train brought new prisoners from occupied countries. The camp grew until it held tens of thousands of women from across the continent: Polish resistance fighters, Russian nurses, French teachers, Jewish mothers, Roma girls, and countless others whose only crime was being born into the wrong group. Each new arrival meant more overcrowding, less food, and harsher conditions. Behind the barbed wire, the SS created a world of twisted order. Every woman was registered, photographed, and tattooed with a number. Names were forbidden. Language itself became a weapon. German commands shouted over a mix of Polish, French, Russian, and Hungarian voices, creating chaos and fear. The women slept on wooden bunks, stacked 3 high, packed so tightly that there was no space to turn. They worked from dawn until dark, constructing new buildings, clearing forests, sewing uniforms, and later producing weapons and ammunition for German companies like Siemens. Labor was not a task. It was a sentence designed to destroy the body. But the cruelty of Ravensbrück did not end with hunger or exhaustion. It was also a sight of terror masked as science. In the camp's hospital, SS doctors performed medical experiments on hundreds of Polish women, cutting open their legs, infecting them with bacteria, inserting foreign objects, and observing how long it took for the wounds to rot. These victims became known as the rabbits because their legs were scarred and deformed like laboratory animals. Many died from infection or execution. Those who lived bore the scars for the rest of their lives. And yet, even in this engineered nightmare, the spirit of resistance quietly took root. The women shared smuggled scraps of paper, whispered news from the outside world, and hid each other from selection for death transports. Among the barbed wire and watchtowers, acts of kindness became small revolutions. When one woman collapsed from exhaustion, others lifted her. When a song was forbidden, someone would hum it softly in the night. By 1944, Ravensbrück had become the central hub of a network of more than 40 satellite camps scattered across Germany. Its population swelled beyond capacity, disease spread, and starvation worsened. Death was constant in the crematorium, in the infirmary, or during the endless marches to nowhere. But the women endured. Some wrote poems on scraps of fabric. Others kept their faith through prayer or the simple act of remembering their real names. In doing so, they preserved the last fragments of their humanity. Ravensbrück was meant to erase them, to prove that women could be broken as easily as men, that compassion could not survive inside barbed wire. Yet history would prove the opposite. For inside those barracks, amidst hunger and brutality, something indestructible began to grow, the quiet courage of women who refused to surrender their souls. And that courage, like a faint song carried on the wind, would soon become their most powerful weapon. Morning in Ravensbrück began long before the sun. A whistle would pierce the frozen air, dragging every prisoner out of her restless sleep. The women rose in darkness, shivering, their bodies stiff from the cold that crept through the thin wooden walls of the barracks. There was no time to stretch, no time to think. They lined up outside for roll call, thousands of them standing motionless in the icy wind, sometimes for hours. As the SS guards counted and recounted, shouting insults and striking those who moved too slowly. Many collapsed before the count was finished, their bodies too weak to endure the endless waiting. Those who fell were often kicked or dragged away, and the line did not stop for them. The rhythm of the camp was mechanical, unfeeling, and absolute. The first meal of the day was barely food, a thin liquid they called coffee, bitter and tasteless. Later came a bowl of watery soup with a few scraps of turnip, or a small piece of bread often covered with mold. Hunger ruled every thought. The women learned to eat slowly, to make each bite last longer, to share crumbs as if they were gold. Food became both life and torture. It was never enough, and yet it was all that kept them moving. Starvation carved deep shadows into their faces, turned hands into bones, and eyes into hollow wells of exhaustion. After roll call, the prisoners marched to their work sites. Some were sent to the Siemens factory, sewing electrical parts and fuses for the German army. Others labored outside, cutting wood, carrying stones, or digging trenches in the freezing mud. The strongest women tried to help the weakest, an arm under a shoulder, a whispered word of encouragement, but guards watched for any sign of compassion. They punished kindness as if it were rebellion. A woman who stopped to help another might be beaten, or worse, selected for punishment duty. Yet still, they helped each other. Because in a place built to erase humanity, helping another was the only way to prove they still possessed it. The guards of Ravensbrück were mostly women too, members of the SS trained in cruelty. They wore neat uniforms, polished boots, and a hatred that seemed endless. Dorothea Benz, one of the most infamous, was known for her cold efficiency. She would walk between the barracks with her dog, choosing victims at random to beat or execute. Many of these female guards were young, some barely in their 20s, yet their faces showed no mercy. They had been taught that compassion was weakness, that obedience to the Reich was a duty higher than conscience. The power they held over the prisoners gave them a sense of control, even as they became tools of a system far more monstrous than they could understand. Every evening, when the women returned from work, they were forced again to stand in formation for roll call. It did not matter if it rained, snowed, or froze. They stood until the guards were satisfied. The dead were counted too, their bodies laid out beside the living. The women were forbidden to cry. Crying drew attention, and attention meant punishment. So they stood in silence, staring ahead, the smell of smoke from the crematorium drifting through the air like a constant reminder of what waited for them all. Inside the barracks, there was no comfort. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, sickness, and despair. Lice crawled through the straw mattresses, and the women scratched themselves until their skin bled. Those who fell often tried to hide their symptoms, knowing that being sent to the infirmary could mean a death sentence. There were no real medicines, only painkillers and experiments. The SS doctors performed operations without anesthesia, and those who survived were rarely the same again. But beyond the hunger, beyond the cold and disease, the worst cruelty of Ravensbrück was the loss of identity. Each woman was stripped of her clothes, her hair, her name. She became a number, sewn onto a piece of cloth pinned to her uniform. The guards used the numbers, never the names. It was a calculated act, a way to erase the self, to turn people into things. Some women, desperate not to forget who they were, whispered their names to each other at night, repeating them like prayers. "I am Anna," one would say. "I am Maria. I am Yvonne." They reminded each other that before this place, they had lives, families, laughter. They had been human once, and they would be again, if they survived. Sleep was shallow and haunted. The nights were filled with whispers, moans, and the distant barking of dogs. Dreams were cruel, visions of home, of food, of freedom, always ending with the shock of waking up still behind the wire. Some women stopped dreaming altogether, their minds too weary to imagine anything beyond the next day. Others clung to memories as a way to stay alive. One woman remembered the smell of her child's hair, another, the sound of her mother's voice singing in the kitchen. These memories became invisible armor, small fragments of warmth in a world of ice. And yet, amidst all this, there was something the SS could never completely destroy: the will to live. The women found strength in glances, in the touch of a hand, in the brief moments when they could smile despite everything. Each act of survival, each breath, was a form of resistance. To wake up, to stand through roll call, to sing softly in the dark. These became ways of saying, "You have not defeated me yet." In Ravensbrück, hell had many faces: hunger, violence, despair. But within its walls, humanity still flickered, fragile, trembling, but alive. It was this fragile flame, passed from woman to woman, that would one day light the path toward freedom. And as the war dragged on, when even the guards began to sense the approaching end, that quiet flame of courage burned brighter than ever. Hidden beneath the ashes of cruelty, in the shadow of despair, the smallest gestures became acts of rebellion. A whispered word, a shared crumb of bread, a gentle touch, these were the sparks of humanity that refused to die in Ravensbrück. Among thousands of women reduced to numbers, friendship became both a weapon and a shield. It was dangerous to care, but impossible not to. When everything else was taken from them, the women discovered that their greatest strength lay in one another. It began with the simplest of acts. A woman hiding a crust of bread in her sleeve for a friend who was too weak to stand. Another tearing a strip from her own blanket to wrap around someone's wounded feet. A Polish prisoner offering to translate for a Russian woman who could not understand the shouted German orders. Language, once a barrier, became a bridge built on compassion. They learned to read faces, to communicate with nods and glances, to share warmth through silence. These quiet acts of kindness spread through the camp like a secret network, invisible but alive, holding them together when everything else fell apart. At night, when the lights were out and the guards retreated to their quarters, the barracks transformed. The women whispered stories to one another, tales of their families, their homes, their children. Some spoke of their villages and cities, now lost to war, of gardens and schoolrooms and laughter. These stories became a kind of sanctuary, a place where they could exist as themselves again, if only for a few moments. Others taught lessons in the dark. A French teacher reciting poetry, a Polish mathematician scribbling formulas on the floor with a piece of coal, a nurse explaining anatomy to girls who had never gone to school. In this secret classroom of the night, knowledge became a rebellion against ignorance and cruelty. Friendship also carried the weight of sacrifice. When one woman grew sick, others risked punishment to care for her. They shared their soup, cleaned her wounds, and whispered comfort when death drew near. Some offered to take another's place in labor lines or to hide those marked for execution. Every act of solidarity came with risk, a risk of being caught, beaten, or killed, but it also gave meaning to survival. To live for oneself was almost impossible in Ravensbrück. To live for another gave life a reason. There were moments when despair overwhelmed them, when death felt closer than hope. But in those moments, they found strength in one another's eyes. A smile could mean more than food. A song hummed under the breath could remind them that the world still existed beyond the wire. One survivor later said, "We kept each other alive not with bread, but with love." That love was quiet, wordless, and constant. It moved from woman to woman like a hidden current, stronger than the fear that ruled the camp. The guards tried to crush these bonds. They separated friends, sent them to different work details, punished them for talking. But friendship in Ravensbrück had no borders. It lived in memory, in the shared rhythm of breathing through cold nights, in the promise that if one of them survived, she would remember the others. Many women made silent vows. "If I live, I will tell your story." Those promises became lifelines, keeping them connected to a future beyond the camp, a future where their suffering would have meaning. Even the smallest kindness became an act of defiance against the Nazi dream of total domination. Each gesture whispered the same truth, that the human spirit cannot be fully conquered. These women were not soldiers or revolutionaries in the usual sense, but their compassion was a form of resistance stronger than any weapon. They refused to become the creatures the SS wanted them to be. They refused to let hatred define them. Sometimes they laughed. It was rare and dangerous, but laughter in Ravensbrück was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Someone might tell a joke, or mimic a guard's pompous strut, and for a few seconds the barack would shake with muffled giggles. It was not the laughter of joy, but of defiance, a fragile reminder that even in the heart of darkness, they were still alive. The friendships forged in Ravensbrück were not fleeting. They became sacred pacts, the kind of bonds that could never exist in the ordinary world. They were born from pain, tempered by fear, and sustained by the sheer will to survive. When liberation finally came, many women would remember these friendships as the one thing that kept them human. Some met again years later, gray-haired and fragile, and when they looked into each other's eyes, they did not need words. They had already shared everything: hunger, loss, courage, and faith. Within the camp's endless cruelty, these women built a hidden world of tenderness. It was invisible to the guards, silent to the outside world, yet it was real, more real than the violence that surrounded them. In that hidden world, they found meaning. In one another, they found salvation. And as the war dragged toward its bitter end, these threads of friendship would weave together into something unbreakable, a chorus of hearts that refused to be silenced. It was within this fragile, secret sisterhood that the first notes of song began to rise, soft at first, trembling, but full of life, the songs that would soon become their final, fearless act of resistance. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, a hum in the darkness, a melody carried by trembling lips after another day of exhaustion and fear. In Ravensbrück, where every breath could be punished, the act of singing was an act of defiance. The women who sang did not do so to entertain or to forget. They sang because it was the only way to remember who they were. Music became their final refuge, a fragile thread tying them to the world that the barbed wire had tried to erase. No one knows who sang first. Perhaps it was a mother remembering a lullaby she once sang to her child. Perhaps it was a teacher reciting a hymn from church, or a young girl whispering a folk song from her village in Poland. Slowly, others joined in. The notes were faint, so soft they could almost be mistaken for breathing, but within those whispers lived something indestructible: hope. The songs were forbidden, and yet they spread from barack to barack, carried like secret prayers between souls who refused to give up. The camp was filled with women from across Europe: Poles, French, Russians, Czechs, Norwegians, Dutch, Jews, and Roma. They spoke different languages, but in song, they found a common tongue. Someone began a Polish folk tune, and others picked up the rhythm, weaving their own languages into the melody. The words changed, but the feeling was the same: a longing for home, a cry for freedom, a promise to endure. For a few fleeting moments, the cold walls of the barracks disappeared, and the women stood together in a world made entirely of sound and memory. The guards forbade singing, of course. They saw music as dangerous, and it was. Songs gave the women strength, and strength was something the Nazis could not allow. Yet even under threat of beating or execution, the women continued to sing. They sang quietly while working, humming under their breath as they sewed uniforms for the soldiers who had imprisoned them. They sang during the marches to the labor sites, moving in rhythm to the melody only they could hear. Music became their rebellion, their invisible uprising against a system built on silence and obedience. Among the songs born in Ravensbrück, one became legend: the Song of the Women of Ravensbrück, often called the Hymn of Ravensbrück. It was said to have been composed secretly by prisoners, with lyrics passed from mouth to mouth, never written down for fear of discovery. The hymn spoke of endurance, of faith, of the unbroken will of women who refused to vanish into the smoke of the crematorium. "Even if we die here," it whispered, "our song will live on." For many, that song was not only music. It was a declaration of existence. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when the guards were asleep and the camp was shrouded in fog, a single voice would rise, soft, clear, trembling. One by one, others joined. The harmony was fragile, imperfect, but achingly human. Those who listened later said that in those moments, the camp was transformed. The air itself seemed to change. For a few precious minutes, the fences disappeared, and the women were free, free in spirit, if not in body. Music also carried memory. It reminded them of their children, their lovers, their homes. A Polish lullaby could bring tears to a Russian nurse's eyes because she, too, knew what it meant to lose everything. A French hymn could make a Czech woman whisper her own prayers. In the shared language of melody, they rediscovered their humanity. In a place designed to erase identity, song gave it back to them. The songs were not always sad. Some were full of humor, parodying the absurdity of their captors. Women would quietly invent verses mocking the guards or the endless roll calls. It was dangerous, deadly, even, but laughter through song became another form of resistance. They sang about the cold, about hunger, about hope. In every note, there was both pain and defiance. The guards could command their bodies, but they could not command their spirits. There were times when singing became an act of farewell. When a woman was selected for execution, her friends might sing softly as she was led away, their voices trembling but unbroken. It was their way of giving her dignity, of promising that she would not be forgotten. Some survivors later said that hearing those songs was both the most heartbreaking and most beautiful experience of their lives, proof that love could exist even on the threshold of death. The power of song in Ravensbrück was not about the beauty of music, but the courage it required. Every note sung was a risk, a whisper of freedom in a world built to crush it. Yet through that music, the women built an invisible fortress, one the Nazis could not penetrate. It gave them strength to endure another day, to remember their names, to believe that beyond the wire, the world was still listening. Decades later, when survivors gathered to remember, they sang those same songs again. Their voices were older, shakier, but the melodies had not changed. The notes carried the memory of those who did not survive, the sisters who had stood beside them in the dark. They sang for them, for all the nameless women whose voices were silenced too soon. The Song of Ravensbrück had become a hymn for the dead, and for the living, a reminder that even in the deepest hell, the human spirit can still find a way to sing. In the end, the songs of Ravensbrück were more than music. They were resistance, prayer, and testimony. They were the sound of women reclaiming their humanity in a place designed to destroy it. The melodies that once rose in secret beneath the barbed wire now echo across history, carried by those who remember. And somewhere in the wind that blows through the empty camp today, if you listen closely, you can still hear them, a faint, eternal harmony, the voices of the women who dared to sing in hell. When the gates of Ravensbrück finally opened in the spring of 1945, silence fell over the camp. The machine guns were quiet. The shouting stopped. The watchtowers stood empty. For the first time in years, the air carried not the smell of burning flesh or chemicals, but the faint scent of spring. Liberation had come, though it did not arrive like the sudden dawn the women had dreamed of. It came slowly, almost hesitantly, as if the world itself was unsure how to face what had happened inside those fences. By then, Ravensbrück was a graveyard of ghosts. Of the more than 130,000 women who had passed through its gates, tens of thousands were dead from starvation, disease, executions, or the merciless medical experiments that had mutilated their bodies. The survivors were barely recognizable as human beings, skeletal, hollow-eyed, their clothes hanging in rags, their skin gray from hunger and infection. When the Soviet troops entered the camp on April 30, 1945, they found thousands of women still alive but on the edge of death. Many could not stand. Some did not understand that they were free. Others wept without sound, unable to comprehend that the nightmare was over. But even in that moment of freedom, pain remained. Liberation was not the end of suffering. It was the beginning of remembrance. The survivors had been freed from Ravensbrück, but Ravensbrück would never be freed from them. The barbed wire still lived inside their minds. The roll calls echoed in their dreams. The faces of lost friends haunted their waking hours. The world outside the camp was bright and alive. Yet for many women, it felt unreal, distant, almost hostile. How could they explain what had happened? How could anyone understand? Some returned home to find that their families were gone, their homes destroyed, their countries changed beyond recognition. They carried invisible scars, trauma, guilt, silence. Many could not speak about what they had seen for years. The memories were too heavy, the words too small. And yet, slowly, they began to write, to testify, to remember. They gathered in small groups, in living rooms and community halls, decades later, to share their stories. Some spoke softly, others with tears, and others with a calm that only survivors know. "We lived through something that must never happen again," one woman said. "We speak so that silence will not kill the truth." From their testimonies, the world began to piece together what Ravensbrück truly was, not just a camp, but a universe of cruelty and courage. The women told of their work in the factories, the punishments, the experiments, the executions. But they also spoke of friendship, of laughter, of secret songs sung in the night. They remembered how one woman shared her last piece of bread, how another whispered prayers over the dying, how they held hands as the gas chambers waited. And they remembered the songs, those fragile, trembling songs that had carried them through hell. In the years that followed, the camp became a memorial. The barracks were torn down, but the foundations remained, marked by plaques and stones. Survivors returned, some for the first time since their liberation, walking the same paths they had once marched as prisoners. They placed flowers on the lake's edge, where ashes had been scattered. They sang the hymn of Ravensbrück. Again, their aging voices breaking but strong. For a moment, the air was filled once more with the sound of resistance, no longer forbidden, but honored. For the younger generations, the women became living witnesses, their lives a bridge between the unimaginable past and the fragile present. Schools invited them to speak. Historians recorded their words. Artists and musicians turned their memories into poems, films, and songs. Through remembrance, the women of Ravensbrück found a new purpose: to make sure that their suffering would not vanish into the silence of history. "We survived," one survivor said, "so that the world would remember not only how we died, but how we lived." Today, when you walk through Ravensbrück, the air is still. The wind rustles through the birch trees, and the lake reflects the sky like a mirror of memory. The barracks are gone, but the outlines remain, carved into the earth like scars. Each stone in the memorial bears a name, a nation, a date, and for the countless unknowns, a single word, unbeckoned. But even the nameless are remembered. Their songs, their courage, their friendships have become part of something eternal. The story of Ravensbrück is not only a story of horror. It is a story of what it means to be human when humanity is stripped away. It is a story of women who refused to surrender their souls, who found beauty in the unthinkable, who turned whispers into defiance and fear into song. The camp was meant to erase them, but they left behind echoes that will never fade. When the last survivors are gone, their voices will still linger in the wind over that quiet lake. And perhaps, if you stand there long enough, you will hear them, faint but clear, rising from the earth like a memory that refuses to die. It is the sound of endurance, of hope, of women who sang not because they were free, but because they dreamed of freedom. And in their song, the world is reminded of its deepest truth, that even in the darkest night, the human spirit will always find a way to sing. Time has moved on, and the world has changed. The war ended generations ago, and most of the women who once walked through Ravensbrück's gates have long since passed away. Yet their voices still echo, not only in museums or history books, but in the conscience of humanity. Ravensbrück was not just a place of death, it was a mirror held up to the human soul, reflecting both its darkest cruelty and its most luminous strength. The lessons it offers are not bound to the past. They speak to us now, perhaps more urgently than ever. The first lesson is the fragility of humanity itself. The women of Ravensbrück were not soldiers or criminals. They were teachers, mothers, nurses, students, ordinary people who believed in ordinary lives. And yet, under a regime built on hatred and fear, they were stripped of their identities and condemned to die simply for being who they were. It reminds us that civilization is not guaranteed. It must be protected, nurtured, and defended every single day. The machinery of cruelty that built Ravensbrück did not begin with violence. It began with words, with laws, with silence. It began when neighbors stopped seeing each other as human. The second lesson is the indestructible power of compassion. Amidst unimaginable suffering, the women found ways to care for one another, to share, to sing, to teach, to hope. Their friendship was a rebellion against the very system that sought to divide them. When they risked their lives to give a dying friend a sip of water or a moment of warmth, they were asserting something revolutionary, that love, even in its smallest form, is stronger than hatred. Ravensbrück became a place where the definition of heroism changed. It was no longer measured by victory, but by kindness, not by survival alone, but by the refusal to abandon one's humanity. The third lesson is the responsibility of remembrance. The women who survived made a vow, not just to the dead, but to the future. They spoke not to relive their pain, but to ensure that no generation would ever forget. What happens when indifference takes root? To forget would be to kill twice, one survivor said. Every story told, every song remembered, every name engraved on a memorial is a shield against the repetition of history. Memory is not a passive act, it is resistance. It demands courage, empathy, and the willingness to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil can exist anywhere, even in the most civilized of societies. The fourth lesson is the enduring power of voice. Ravensbrück tried to silence women, to erase them. Yet, decades later, their words still speak across time. The diaries, the testimonies, the letters smuggled from the camp, these fragments of language became eternal. In them, the women reclaimed their existence. They remind us that storytelling is more than history, it is survival. Every time a voice is raised against injustice, every time truth is spoken in defiance of power, the spirit of Ravensbrück's women lives on. And finally, the last lesson is hope, the quiet, stubborn hope that refused to die even in the darkest of places. Hope was not naive optimism, it was endurance. It was the act of singing in the face of death, of believing that one day someone would listen. Hope is what built the world after the war, and it is what keeps it from collapsing again. The women of Ravensbrück did not live to see the world made perfect, but they planted the seeds of conscience in every generation that followed. Today, when people visit Ravensbrück, they do not come only to mourn. They come to learn, to listen, to remember. They walk along the lake, stand before the stone monuments, and read the names carved into marble. They hear recordings of the hymn of Ravensbrück and feel, for a moment, the immense weight of those voices. Some cry, others stand in silence. All leave changed. The camp, once a place of suffering, has become a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The world still struggles with the same shadows, prejudice, violence, fear of difference. But if Ravensbrück teaches us anything, it is that darkness can be resisted, and humanity can endure even when all seems lost. The women who sang in that camp did not know that their voices would reach the future. They sang simply because they needed to remember who they were. Yet, in doing so, they gave us a legacy that transcends time. Their song belongs to all who have ever fought to be free, to all who have ever faced cruelty with courage, to all who believe that dignity is a right no power can erase. When we speak of Ravensbrück, we do not only speak of the past, we speak of ourselves, of the choices we make, the compassion we show, the voices we choose to raise. And so, as the wind drifts once more through the quiet fields of Ravensbrück, it carries with it a message that still burns with truth. Remember us. Protect the light. Never let the world forget what happens when love is silenced. The song that began in whispers under the shadow of death continues to echo, through generations, through nations, through time itself. It reminds us that even in the deepest darkness, there will always be those who choose to sing. Ravensbrück is silent now, but its silence is not empty. It is filled with memory, with the echoes of voices that refuse to vanish. The camp, once a machine of dehumanization, has become a monument to resilience, to courage, and to the indomitable spirit of women who would not surrender their humanity. Every stone, every path, every plaque bears witness not only to suffering but to defiance, to love, and to survival. It reminds us that even in the face of the most calculated cruelty, the human spirit can endure. The legacy of Ravensbrück is not measured merely in numbers, tens of thousands dead, over 100,000 imprisoned. It is measured in the intangible, in the acts that cannot be counted, a hand held in the dark, a whispered word of encouragement, a song sung softly to keep hope alive. These women, stripped of names and identities, found ways to preserve both. In their friendship, their courage, and their voices, they created a sanctuary within a world designed to destroy them. Their story is a call to remember, but also a call to act. Ravensbrück teaches us that evil is never abstract. It thrives when humanity is silent, when injustice is ignored, when compassion is withheld. The women of the camp resisted not with weapons, but with empathy, defiance, and the simple act of staying human. Their example challenges us to do the same in our own lives, to speak out, to care, and to protect those whose voices are threatened or silenced. Memory itself is a form of resistance. By remembering Ravensbrück, by telling the stories of those who suffered and survived, we honor not only their pain, but their courage. Each time a survivor's testimony is shared, each time the hymn of Ravensbrück is sung, the legacy of these women grows stronger. It reminds the world that even the darkest chapters of history cannot erase the light of those who choose to endure, to help, and to resist. And so, when we stand at the edge of the quiet lake where ashes were scattered, when we walk along the paths once filled with fear and suffering, we do more than observe history. We participate in a living memory. We hear, if we listen carefully, the faint strains of song carried on the wind, the voices of women who refuse to be broken, who refuse to be silent, and who remind us that courage is born not only in victory, but in persistence, in care, and in the refusal to let evil define us. Ravensbrück was built to erase them, but it failed. They left behind something far stronger than walls or wire, a testament to what it means to be human, even in the face of unimaginable darkness. Their songs, their friendships, their acts of quiet defiance, and their unyielding hope continue to resonate, transcending time and place. They are no longer prisoners. They are teachers, witnesses, and guides for all who seek to remember and to uphold the dignity of the human spirit. In the end, the story of Ravensbrück is a story of survival, not merely of the body but of the soul. It is a reminder that even when all seems lost, even when the world is designed to crush the human spirit, hope can endure, love can persist, and courage can shine. The women who sang in Ravensbrück may have walked through fire, hunger, and death, but their voices still rise today, calling to us across generations. Remember us. Protect humanity. Keep singing. And in that song, we find the greatest lesson of all, that the human spirit, once awakened, can never truly be silenced. It lives on, in memory, in history, and in the hearts of all who dare to listen. Ravensbrück may have been a place of darkness, but the women who endured it left behind a light that will never fade.